What's up, guys? John the Morgile here, checking in for an update to my most recent video describing a bombshell against the heliocentric theory. I had intended to do an update to that video anyway because it was sort of hard to describe the point, and I had just figured out this major problem with the heliocentric model the day that I released the video, or I pulled an all-nighter getting it out as quickly as possible because this really is huge evidence against the heliocentric theory. But you know, although the point isn't that complex, it is sort of hard to explain. And, you know, furthermore, of course, coming from the flat Earth perspective, we have to describe the heliocentric model prior to debunking it, just so that everybody's on the same page. So maybe I made the argument seem more complex than it is. But anyway, it was and is sort of hard to describe, although I think after this video it should be fairly, you know, obvious to anyone that didn't understand it after the first video. And anyway, I had anticipated, you know, a lot of people possibly not understanding the argument, or of course arguing semantics, which don't really affect the validity of the actual argument whatsoever, or other people simply arguing against the point because they don't understand the problem that was being described in the video. Indeed, I got all of that and then some, but I was rather surprised to find some of the most ridiculous, ineffective, ignorant, and combative arguments coming from a so-called fellow flat earther. Now, I will admit that I was surprised to see how many people actually got it or understood it after just the first video, so in that regard it was a success, although, you know, a good many people still didn't really understand it, and of course you had just globe earth trolls and such arguing semantics as opposed to actually arguing the point. Anyway, so this video is intended to make a few minor corrections to the original video, as a couple of technical errors were included in the presentation or the diagrams. However, these technical errors in my presentation do not affect the validity of the argument whatsoever. And really, the technical errors are quite trite and you know, minuscule. They don't really affect the outcome or the claim whatsoever. So I don't have to retract or change any of my claims. I'm just going to make a few minor corrections to technical errors in the diagrams and such. It wasn't that many. It wasn't that bad, especially for a something that I just figured out in one day and put together during an all-nighter, right? So shoot me in the face, right? I'm only human. Obviously, now, again, I don't need to retract any of the claims and obvious proof described in the video, as they still stand, completely unaffected by the trolling which has surrounded this bombshell, trying to obfuscate the point, you know, confuse people and make it, you know, muddy the waters, make it seem more complex than it is, and of course, claim that I don't know what I'm talking about and the point is moot. But, you know, what do you expect when you're right over the target? Then, of course, you're going to get trolled, and so this bombshell to the heliocentric model certainly received plenty of trolling and shillery. Now, I will divide this sort of follow-up video into 3 sections, each having at least 1 or 2 subsections that need to be covered, plus a bonus section at the end, which is really just delicious. So first, I'll just do a rundown of the sections and then we'll get into it. In terms of corrections, the first one was a mislabeled angle. The angle was mislabeled, however, the angle itself was correct. Simple a mistake, a minor correction, not that big of a deal. The second thing would be the tropical moon. In the video, I stated that the moon remains overhead of the tropics, strictly overhead, bouncing between the tropical areas at all times. There is a minuscule correction to that I need to make to this claim, which doesn't affect the outcome of the main premise either, and is indeed extremely negligible and irrelevant. Finally, the third and final correction that I need to make is yet another mislabeled diagram. The second main section is responses to misunderstandings, trolls, and red herrings. The first thing would be the alignment of the ecliptic and equatorial planes during the equinoxes, the difference between parallel and aligned as a subsection of that. The second thing is the divergence of the moon's orbital plane, and this is again responses to misunderstanding and trolls and red herrings. The second one would be the divergence of the moon's orbital plane relative to the ecliptic plane, extending 238,000 miles allegedly. And finally, the third response to misunderstandings, trolls, and red herrings is the difference between the ecliptic plane and the equatorial plane, which there is a big differentiation to make. And finally, the third main section is going to be a recap of the bombshell argument. Hopefully, it's just a compressed version that should knock it home for anybody that sort of wasn't 100% following along with the argument. And within that main section, we'll have, first off, the moon's divergence from the ecliptic, and secondly, the ecliptic's divergence from the equatorial plane. So, first, let's get the technical error correction section done first, as this won't take long, and it's just a couple of minor corrections, so we might as well get them out of the way first. The first correction is a mislabeled angle. This diagram here that was used in the previous video shows a 23.4 degree angle labeled as a 66.6 degree angle. Now, the angle is indeed 23.4 degrees, which I'll demonstrate in a minute, and is not a 66.6 degree angle. So the diagram was correct, representing the angles of the heliocentric model. However, the 23.4 degree angle was merely mislabeled by mistake, so the diagram was fine other than the mislabeling of the angle. Now, this was an honest mistake that what happened was I had copy and pasted the 66.6 degree value from a previous slide, which was describing, of course, the Earth's alleged axis of rotation being 66.6 degrees misaligned to the ecliptic plane. And so what happened was I copy and pasted that and simply forgot to change the value from 66.6 to 23.4, and then I made clones of that diagram for subsequent diagrams, so the mistake was sort of grandfathered in, and I didn't catch it because, you know, I was pulling an all-nighter to get this really bombshell evidence out. So again, the diagram is 100% accurate in regards to the angles according to the heliocentric model. However, the only correction which needs to be made is to change the assigned value of the angle from 66.6 degrees to 23.4 degrees. And again, the angle itself does not need to be changed, and so the diagram still stands in terms of the point I was making. You know, it's like, whoops, I made a mistake, shoot me, I'm human. And just to show you what a 66.6 degree angle would be from that equatorial plane, I put a blue line there that kind of goes through the compass. That blue line represents a 66.6 degree angle from the equatorial plane. So as you can see, the angle that I had there was clearly a 23.4 degree angle, and the error was just a minor technical error. Just me made a mistake, mislabeled the angle. Whoops. Okay, the second correction is going to be regarding the tropical moon. In the bombshell video, I stated that the moon apparently remains overhead of the tropics, bouncing between the tropics once per month. Now, this is practically correct, although a minor correction is in order. According to the heliocentric proponents who want to pick apart semantics in this argument, as opposed to facing the bombshell it truly is head on. So the tropics are 23.5 degrees north or south of the equator. Apparently, the moon allegedly travels as far north or south of the tropics a mere 5 degrees, or exactly 28.61 degrees north or south. So we're talking about a very minor amount in the grand scheme of things, and it certainly doesn't invalidate the whole premise of the video, which has to do with the moon's orbital plane. So compared to the tropics, there's a mere 5-degree difference, which is negligible in terms of the moon's trajectory, and you can practically say that the moon remains overhead somewhere between the tropics all year long. You can clearly see in this image here, which is a Mercator projection, the minuscule difference between 23.5 degrees and 28.61 degrees relative to the entire 90-degree north or south latitude. You can practically say that 2.23 28.61 north and 28.61 south, entail the tropics, as the mere 5-degree divergence is negligible, and the moon would spend the least amount of time in these areas, and frankly this minor adjustment does not affect the crux of the argument presented in the slightest. This correction is so minuscule, it is thus irrelevant to the main premise of the argument, in fact, which involves the moon's orbital plane being 5 degrees divergent from the ecliptic plane, or the plane which the Earth supposedly orbits around the sun upon. Not even considering the misalignment between the equatorial plane and the ecliptic plane just yet, one huge problem, again, is the fact that when you stretch a 5-degree divergent line out 238,000 miles, which is the alleged distance to the moon, then at its extreme points of divergence from the ecliptic, the moon would be thousands of miles north or south of the ecliptic, and even thousands of miles north or south of the cross-section of the Earth relative to the ecliptic, which I'll describe in this diagram, so there's really no question about this whatsoever. The fact that the moon remains practically between the tropics for all intents and purposes, only straying a hair north or south overhead from the tropics, is simply impossible according to the heliocentric model, as the moon should be positioned thousands of miles north or south of the Earth relative to the ecliptic plane when you extend the 5-degree orbital plane of the moon out 238,000 miles. This correction, in terms of the moon remaining practically between the two tropics overhead, it's still well outside the possible parameters to observe the moon stuck essentially between the tropics when its orbital plane is allegedly 5 degrees offset from the ecliptic plane. Furthermore, the ecliptic plane itself is 23.4 degrees offset from the equatorial plane, which will throw that tropical alignment of the moon off by an additional 23.4 degrees, according to an observer on Earth. The third correction that needs to be made is yet another mislabeled diagram. The diagram here shows the ecliptic plane in alignment to the equatorial plane according to an observer on Earth. The lines ascribed to the equinoxes above and below the Sun in the diagram are intended to show the angle which the ecliptic hits the Earth, not the equator. I simply didn't place a line to represent the equator, which will always be 90 degrees to the axis, which again was a minor technical error, but of course the trolls, shills, and Crypto-GlobeTards are attacking this minor error in the diagram as opposed to even attempting to refute the main premise of the argument involving the moon's orbital plane itself, essentially avoiding the main topic altogether by obfuscating the topic and arguing semantics and diagrams as opposed to logically refuting or even attempting to do so, or even mentioning anything whatsoever about the moon's orbital plane relative to the equatorial plane, which indeed shows they're either missing the point entirely or they're intentionally muddying the waters of this so as to make it seem more confusing than it actually is, and making the claims that I don't know what I'm talking about and it's a moot point. Section 2, responses to the misunderstandings, trolls, and red herrings. The first section of this would be the alignment of the ecliptic and equatorial planes during the equinoxes. While the bombshell argument has everything to do with the moon's orbital plane being an extreme misalignment to the equatorial plane, not to be confused with the ecliptic plane, many a troll and shill and Crypto-GlobeTard flat earth imposters incessantly argue semantics about the equatorial plane and ecliptic plane, which I accurately described and diagrammed according to the heliocentric hypothesis, totally ignoring, nay, evading the main topic altogether, these trolls and shills and Crypto-GlobeTards. Again, the main premise of the bombshell discovery that I described in my most recent video right before this involves the moon's orbital plane relative to the equatorial plane, which is misaligned to the ecliptic plane substantially. This bombshell even applies to the heliocentric model independent and regardless of the alignment between the ecliptic and equatorial planes, if you want to know the truth. This is because of the alleged 5-degree misalignment of the moon's orbital plane relative to the ecliptic extended 238,000 miles, placing the moon thousands of miles north or south of the ecliptic plane. These trolls, shills, and Crypto-GlobeTard flat earth imposters literally inserted words into my mouth, for example, the word parallel, to describe the alignment between the ecliptic and equatorial planes during the equinox. I urge anyone to watch the bombshell video again and find the word parallel spoken one single time. Just to give you a hint, you will not find the word parallel spoken one single time in that video. Furthermore, never was any claim made regarding the equatorial planes and ecliptic planes becoming parallel during the equinoxes, nor was any such claim alluded to or even implied. The terms aligned and misaligned were certainly used, which is exactly the terminology which the heliocentric model uses to describe the equinoxes and the solstices. The heliocentric model clearly asserts that the equatorial plane is indeed aligned to the ecliptic plane according to an observer on Earth during the equinoxes. This is not my claim, that is the heliocentric claim. For shills and trolls to fallaciously insert the claim involving them being parallel into my mouth is an underhanded, outright lie. The equatorial plane and ecliptic plane are constantly changing relative alignments to one another according to an observer on Earth. That is caused by the Earth's orbit and its tilt, allegedly. This is what causes the seasons in the heliocentric model. This is what causes the sun to apparently travel between the tropics over the course of a year, meaning the equatorial plane is indeed misaligned to the ecliptic plane during the solstices by 23.4 degrees, according to an observer on Earth, assuming the heliocentric model, and is in direct alignment with the ecliptic plane during the equinoxes, according to an observer on Earth, assuming the heliocentric model. This is what allegedly causes the sun overhead to travel from tropic to tropic and back over the course of the year. This is what supposedly causes the season, according to the logically repulsive heliocentric hypothesis. Just so we're on the same page, here are the definitions of parallel and aligned or alignment, or the differences between parallel and aligned. The definition of aligned or alignment is either A, arrangement in a straight line or in correct appropriate relative positions, or B, place or arrange things in a straight line. The definition of parallel is of lines, planes, surfaces, or objects side by side and having the same distance continuously between them. Parallel lines never meet, is an example. Again, the word parallel was never mentioned or even implied one single time in the whole video, yet at least 3 trolls, shills, and Crypto-GlobeTard flat earth imposters claimed several times each that my description of the equinoxes involved the concept of parallel. I will quickly mention that the terms parallel and aligned are mutually exclusives and complete opposites to one another. They are obviously creating a straw man argument and debunking the straw man in order to seem like they have a viable position, which they absolutely obviously do not. This underhanded lying and or total misunderstanding of the point being discussed, arguments and semantics abound, still have nothing to do with the main premise, which has everything to do with the moon's alleged orbital plane relative to the ecliptic, while the ecliptic is misaligned to the equatorial plane. Yet, the moon remains a tropical phenomenon for all intents and purposes. The equinoxes are allegedly caused by an alignment between the ecliptic and equatorial planes, according to an observer on Earth, assuming the heliocentric model. This is exactly why Globe-Tards claim the sun apparently moves between the tropics, again due to the hypothetical orbit of the Earth, along with the tilt of the Earth, and the constant phasing between a 23.4 degree misalignment between the equatorial plane and the ecliptic plane over time, according to an observer on Earth, according to the heliocentric model. Without the constant flux between alignment and misalignment of the equatorial plane and ecliptic plane, according to an observer on a hypothetically spherical Earth, the globe-Earth model wouldn't have an explanation for seasons, for crying out loud, so I'm really surprised that I must argue for the globe model against globe-eds, and argue for the globe model against Crypto-GlobeTard flat Earth shills, in order to accurately represent their model. While I completely disagree with the globe model altogether, it really is quite preposterous. Of course, this is annoying, confounding, and just outright unnecessary. It is indeed typical of trolls and shills trying to muddy the waters of flat Earth reality, subconsciously steering people towards believing that flat Earth reality belongs in the realm of fairies and unicorns. But if we're going to rationally scrutinize the model, then it's important that we understand the mechanisms by which it operates according to their very numbers, geometry, and claims. During the solstices, the ecliptic plane is 90 degrees overhead of the tropics, while during the equinoxes, the ecliptic plane is 90 degrees over the equator. The equinoxes are definitely caused by an alignment between the equatorial plane and ecliptic plane, humoring the globe-tarded model according to an observer on Earth. However, the lines are not parallel, nor did I ever claim they became parallel, or even utter the word parallel in the entire course of the video. The divergence of the Moon's orbital plane relative to the ecliptic extending 238,000 miles. This would be the next part of arguing against the responses to misunderstandings, trolls, and red herrings. Keeping this in the simplest possible terms, let's just forget about the tilt of the Earth for a minute and do a study in basic geometry. Assuming the Moon is orbiting the ecliptic misaligned by a mere 5 degrees, that doesn't sound like a lot. It doesn't sound like a wide divergence. However, when you extend a line 5 degrees divergent from the equatorial plane, 238,000 miles in terms of the distance of the Moon, you end up with the Moon being a full 16,810 miles north of the North Pole or south of the South Pole relative to the ecliptic plane, or about 20,810 miles north or south of the ecliptic plane itself. This fact alone places the Moon in such a position, on its most extreme divergence from the ecliptic in its orbital path, that it couldn't be considered 90 degrees overhead of the ecliptic plane. Furthermore, it could not be claimed to be 90 degrees overhead of the equatorial plane, nor the tropical plane whatsoever. Sure, sometimes that sort of alignment may be possible. However, other times that alignment is completely impossible, meaning that the Moon should not travel practically between the tropics all the time. Furthermore, the divergence of the ecliptic plane from the equatorial plane makes this divergence even more dramatic, as the equatorial plane is misaligned to the ecliptic itself by 23.4 degrees. There may have been some other ridiculous arguments coming from the trolls, shills, and Crypto-GlobeTards, similar to these, but even less relevant to the points made in the bombshell video that I just made previously. But these are the main ones, which were either intended to confuse the audience or were a result of the trolls themselves being confused about the point. I'm not sure. But in the third section, this is going to be the quick recap of the bombshell argument put in simplest terms. The first section is the Moon's divergence from the ecliptic plane. The main premise of this bombshell observation, which completely refutes the heliocentric model, has everything to do with the Moon's divergence from the ecliptic plane. The ecliptic plane is the fixed plane relative to the Sun, which the Earth allegedly orbits around, and the seasons are caused by the tilt of the Earth, allegedly. The moon supposedly remains between the tropical areas all year long, for all intents and purposes, which is a sheer impossibility in the heliocentric model due to the 5-degree misalignment between the moon's orbital plane and our orbital plane extended out 238,000 miles, causing a divergence between the moon and the ecliptic plane by about 20,810 miles maximum during its furthest point of divergence. Therefore, it couldn't possibly appear overhead of or bouncing between the tropical areas for all intents and purposes due to this massive divergence between the moon's orbital plane and the ecliptic plane itself. The second part of this is the ecliptic plane's divergence from the equatorial plane. And again, the equatorial plane would be pretty darn close to the tropical planes and parallel to the tropical planes. This is indeed the nail in the coffin of the globe-Earth model in respect to this argument, because the equatorial plane is misaligned to the ecliptic plane by 23.4 degrees, allegedly. If you look at this 2-scale diagram, you can see the equatorial plane represented as the red dotted line here. This is clearly divergent from the ecliptic plane altogether. The moon and everything else are allegedly in constant motion and flux between alignment to the ecliptic plane plus or minus 5 degrees, so this diagram exemplifies the maximum divergence between the moon's orbital plane and the equatorial plane, as the tropics are just north and south of the equatorial plane and also parallel to one another. There, I said the word parallel, but this is describing the tropical planes and the equatorial plane. They are indeed allegedly parallel. On the other hand, the equatorial plane, nor the tropical planes, will never be parallel to the ecliptic plane due to the tilt of the Earth and its rigidity in space in theory. On the equinoxes, however, the equatorial plane and the ecliptic plane indeed align with one another, which is the purported cause of spring and autumn, according to the absurd heliocentric theory. Finally, the bonus section. This is my response to the aforementioned possible crypto-GlobeTard flat Earth imposter. I would have just posted this as a single comment on the video and pinned it to the top. However, it was too long to fit in a single comment, and so you can't pin more than one comment. Thus, I was forced to include this in this video. Now, I really don't enjoy breaking people down. However, in this case, it's decidedly delicious, because I know for a fact that the argument presented in the bombshell video I released previous to this was indeed correct and totally valid. And I knew that there would be some people who didn't understand the point described in the first video, so I did expect to go through the comment section, sort of see what sort of questions or arguments would be brought against this bombshell, so that I could make a follow-up video in order to make any minor corrections or elaborations or even simplifications to the argument so that it would be better understood. Now, although I was expecting questions, arguments, and indeed dissent, I honestly didn't expect to be trolled by a so-called flat earther who was arguing semantics and picking apart minor technical errors in a diagram or two, which I've already corrected here, which, as you already know, are very minor and do not affect the outcome of the problem that was being described. Furthermore, this alleged flat earther was stating that I don't understand the heliocentric model, and this argument I'm making is moot, impotent, and irrelevant. They claimed that I misrepresented the heliocentric model, which I did not, and claimed that my imagined misunderstandings of the model equate somehow to disproof of this argument, although they failed to even mention the moon's orbital plane relative to the equatorial plane. So they didn't even offer, even playing devil's advocate, they didn't even offer a viable alternative. Now, I do welcome constructive criticism, questions, and even arguments, but what I do not welcome is self-proclaimed flat earthers essentially attacking me, telling me that I don't understand what I'm talking about, and referring me to a known globe earth shill, flat earth math, as opposed to making an argument for the heliocentric model, playing devil's advocate to explain the divergence of the moon as described in the video. So here comes, this is my entire response to this troll, this possible Crypto-GlobeTarded troll in the comment section of my previous video. Now, I'm not going to say any names, as I don't want to offend or embarrass anyone, so let's just call this suspected Crypto-GlobeTard by a different name. Let's call them Ignoramus Globetardius Operational Roundshillery. And for short, we can just use the initials Igor, which is actually quite fitting, so we don't offend anyone or reveal anyone's identity. Consider Igor a fictitious person who is in no way related to anyone living or dead. Any similarities between Igor and any actual person, living or dead, is merely coincidental. This is, of course, based on a true story regarding to a comment section on a video that I previously released. Should you care to investigate the possible identity of Igor, that is entirely up to the viewer, although I reserve all rights to plausible deniability, hence this caveat statement and the protection of Igor's confidentiality. Hi again, Igor. Anything I say here is not intended to offend you, and I apologize if I've done anything previously to offend you. I'm really sorry, Igor, but it appears you simply don't understand the argument here, which has more to do with the moon's alleged orbital plane relative to the equatorial plane than the equatorial plane's misalignment to the ecliptic plane. I'm not sure why you're so stuck on this differentiation. The argument described in this video refutes the heliocentric model and was never claimed to, quote, prove a flat, motionless Earth. The only way that is achieved is by measuring for geological curvature, axial rotation, and orbital motion, which always produce null results. Since we know through exhaustive experiment that none such theoretical fantasies exist in reality, the Earth clearly cannot be a spinning globe by plain definition. Unfortunately, that very obvious evidence is insufficient for many people, as the heliocentric model claims to have intricate, complicated explanations for all things, including the seasons and observations of the moon's variable position overhead relative to the equator, according to an observer on a hypothetical sphere. As for your quote,
"That doesn't mean the Globe-Tarted model is correct, it just means this particular critique of it isn't a valid one, since the standard model doesn't suggest that there's an alignment of the planes such that they become parallel. It just says the sun's path crosses the point where the ecliptic plane and celestial equatorial plane intersect.
Period.
I think if we're going to reject the globe model, we ought to make sure we understand it first, and that we understand the reasons why the flat Earth model is a better model."
End quote. You know, Igor, or is it Igor? If I didn't know any better, I'd say you were a shill. This is clearly an argument in semantics and has nothing to do with the main premise being described here, which again is the alleged 5-degree offset of the moon's hypothetical orbital plane, which is not the same thing as the equatorial plane. Indeed, one must understand the heliocentric model first, as you say, which is why I played a short clip describing the causes of the seasons according to Globe-Tards, created by Globe-Tards, and for the consumption of Globe-Tards. I honestly didn't think that I would need to explain how preposterous the globe-Earth model is to a proclaimed flat earther, but apparently that is indeed the case. As for this other shilly quote, just saying, quote,
"The standard model doesn't suggest that there's an alignment of the planes such that they become parallel."
End quote. Never did I once state that the standard model purports that the ecliptic plane and equatorial plane become parallel. I said that they were aligned, meaning the angle of attack in terms of solar radiation or in terms of the ecliptic plane would be 90 degrees to the equator during the equinoxes. There's a big difference between alignment and parallel. Now, I did state, for argument's sake, that even if the moon's alleged orbital plane was supposedly 5 degrees offset from the equatorial plane, not to be confused with the ecliptic plane, The distances involved would place it thousands of miles north or south of the ecliptic, a far cry of being a tropical overhead phenomenon, independent of the extreme divergence between the ecliptic plane and the equatorial planes. So again, without even considering the divergence between the ecliptic and the equatorial planes, the sheer 238,000 mile 5-degree divergence would result in like 20,000 miles of the moon being north or south of the ecliptic plane, or north or south of the cross-section of the Earth. When you add the divergence of the equatorial plane into this, it clearly shows that the moon could never be anything near a constantly tropical phenomenon, more or less. The fundamental premise involving the moon's alleged orbital alignment, plus or minus 5 degrees to the ecliptic plane, doesn't have any alleged correlation or relationship to the equatorial plane according to the heliocentric model. Yet, the moon remains apparently overhead, bouncing between the tropics, spending most of its time overhead of the equatorial plane all year long. The Earth allegedly spins upon an axis, while the overhead sun apparently remains exactly 90 degrees overhead the equator for at least 24 hours during the equinox. This is how we allegedly get the seasons spring and autumn, Igor, and this is why Lientists claim that the ecliptic plane and equatorial plane are in alignment during the equinoxes. And again, I must differentiate between alignment and parallel. Now, the only possible way that our equatorial plane could receive a 90-degree angle sunlight for a single day, since we're allegedly spinning on an axis, creating an effect which practically lasts a few days and remains close enough to alignment for several days, is if the equatorial plane and ecliptic plane are in alignment. This is what causes the seasons, according to the heliocentric model. Remember, I'm not making this up, but you seem to misunderstand the argument regarding the moon altogether, and nary one of you even mentioned the moon in any of your so-called refutations of the proof described in the bombshell video. First of all, just so that we're all on the same page, the definition of alignment, or aligned, is A, arrangement in a straight line or in correct appropriate relative positions, or B, to place or arrange things in a straight line. The definition of parallel is of lines, planes, surfaces, or objects side by side having the same distance continuously between them. Parallel lines never meet. I beg you to find the word parallel spoken one single time in this video. Hint, you will not find the word parallel in the entire video. You will also not hear the sentence or even implication that the globe-Earth model necessitates the equatorial plane being parallel to the ecliptic. That is simply a misunderstanding of the argument. It is a misquote of my argument, and you, Igor, filling in the blanks with concepts which I never claimed or implied. Please, do not put words in my mouth, whether you're doing so intentionally or in error. I would greatly appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, Igor, you also said, quote,
"On the equinox, the sun is said to cross their point of intersection. The angle between the two planes doesn't change at all."
End quote. The sun is supposedly stationary relative to the Earth, and the Earth's orbital plane is allegedly fixed relative to the sun. How then does the sun cross anything in the heliocentric model, as you say? The only way such a thing is possible is by the alignment between the ecliptic plane and equatorial planes changing over time relative to one another according to an observer on Earth, assuming the heliocentric model, and this rotation and this misalignment to alignment phase in terms of the seasons, eventually aligning on the equinoxes and experiencing maximum divergence to said alignment during the solstices according to an observer on Earth. Again, this would all be according to a tiny observer on the hypothetical ball Earth due to the alleged tilt of the Earth relative to the Earth's supposedly fixed orbital plane, or the ecliptic. This is claimed to be causal of the apparent motion of the sun over the course of the year, causing it to apparently bounce between the tropics over the course of a year, according to an observer on Earth. the arguments you're making aren't even attempting to refute the problem I'm describing, which is regarding the Moon's orbital plane. The Moon's orbital plane relative to the ecliptic is the whole point here, Igor. I'm not sure why you're proclaiming this is an invalid point when you clearly do not understand the point. Why would you do that? If you don't understand the problem I'm describing, that's okay. I would really welcome, questions and constructive criticism, and I would submit that if people are incredulous or vocally disagree with you by default, as you've mentioned to me previously, this doesn't justify your actions to treat me as such. This is especially true as you have also failed to refute the primary argument described in this video, yet you are attacking it as if the heliocentric model has an explanation for the obvious problem I'm pointing out here. For you to suggest that I do not understand the heliocentric model is laughable. The problem I'm describing with the model is apparently not clicking with you, and perhaps that's the problem. If that's the case, I apologize, as this is probably my inability to adequately describe the point or describe the problem to you so that you can understand what I'm saying, and this probably does not have to do with you being unintelligent or a shill, or does it? The problem has to do with the Moon allegedly being misaligned to the ecliptic plane by 5 degrees, yet somehow remaining apparently overhead the tropical areas throughout the year. Now, granting your claim, for argument's sake, that the ecliptic plane and equatorial plane are never aligned, which is false, would really only strengthen my side of this argument, Igor. If you understood the argument, you would clearly realize this. However, you do not understand the problem with the heliocentric model here that I'm describing. Otherwise, you wouldn't argue that the ecliptic's misalignment to the equatorial plane is permanent, again differentiating between aligned and parallel, because again, the whole point here is the fact that the equatorial plane and ecliptic are divergent. Although I never claimed that they were parallel, they are absolutely indeed aligned, allegedly, according to the heliocentric model, during the equinoxes. Again, differentiating between aligned and parallel, for crying out loud. The entire argument regarding the Moon's orbital plane relies on the hypothetical fact that the ecliptic plane and equatorial plane are not parallel. This is why it is absurd for Team Heliocentric to claim that the Moon's orbital plane is misaligned to the ecliptic, or Earth's orbital plane, by 5 degrees, since the equatorial plane and ecliptic plane are not parallel and are also usually misaligned to one another, except during the equinoxes when they are indeed allegedly aligned. The fact that the Moon remains overhead of the tropics all year long makes exactly no sense whatsoever in light of this evidence, according to the heliocentric model, according to an observer on Earth. That is the crux of this argument, but I'm not sure why I'm having it with a flat earther. Hopefully you understand it now, but I'll just continue. If the Moon's orbital plane is supposedly misaligned to the ecliptic by 5 degrees, and the ecliptic is never aligned to the equatorial plane, according to you, Igor, then how does the Moon apparently remain between the tropics, according to an observer on Earth, on the hypothetically spherical Earth, at all times, just as the Sun does, if and only if we're humoring the heliocentric model? You're claiming that my argument is moot, essentially siding with Team Heliocentric on this one, which is fine. I definitely understand playing the role of devil's advocate. I do it all the time. It really helps us to strengthen and hone our arguments. So, with that being said, please describe how it is possible in the heliocentric model for the Moon to remain apparently between the tropics at all times. If you're going to take that side for the sake of argument, claiming that my entire point in the previous video, Bombshell, is invalid, then you will obviously need an explanation for this, and the burden of proof is on you to provide an explanation, not arguments and semantics, but an explanation using the heliocentric model alone to account for the fact that the Moon remains practically between the tropics at all times. If you concur that such a thing in terms of the moon is not possible in the heliocentric model, then you must concede that this is indeed a valid argument against the model. Now, if you do have some logical argument to support how the heliocentric model allows for the moon to remain apparently overhead of the tropics, when its orbital plane places it 5 degrees offset from the ecliptic plane, then spill it. The point here, which is obviously lost on you, is the fact that the heliocentric theory doesn't explain this observation in the slightest, in terms of the moon remaining practically between the tropics. Now, Igor, I'll let you know I'm on the edge of my seat, waiting to hear your explanation as devil's advocate for the moon remaining as a tropical body, while its orbital path is aligned plus or minus 5 degrees to the ecliptic plane. Now, we certainly can agree, at least, that the equatorial plane and ecliptic plane do not remain aligned year-round, as you claim they are never aligned relative to one another. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the seasons on a hypothetical sphere. Or are you saying that we don't have seasons in the heliocentric model, Igor? I'm seriously asking because I'm not sure where your head is at. No offense intended. Now, the only way this would make sense in terms of the moon in the heliocentric model would be to assume that the moon somehow intuitively remains plus or minus 5 degrees from the equatorial plane, which is plus or minus 23.4 degrees misaligned to the ecliptic plane. Although they do not claim the moon is practically aligned to the equatorial plane, they indeed claim instead that it is practically aligned to the ecliptic plane. Of course, this still wouldn't work, assuming that they change their story and say that it's the moon is orbiting relative to the equatorial plane. This still wouldn't work due to the 238,000-mile-long 5-degree misalignment between the moon's orbital plane and the hypothetical ecliptic plane. So, even if they try to change their story and say that the moon is practically aligned to the equatorial plane, it still doesn't explain the moon being overhead of the tropics at all times. When you realize the misalignment between the ecliptic plane and the equatorial plane relative to the season, according to an observer on Earth hypothetically, and the moon's alleged orbital divergence from the ecliptic plane, it makes absolutely no sense in the heliocentric model for the moon to be a practically tropical phenomenon, spending most of its time overhead of the equatorial plane. If you understand this now, that is why I made this argument, made that video. Now, I'm not sure if you're arguing against this total flop of the heliocentric model because you want to confuse people, which would make you a troll, or do you simply not understand the problem? I'm honestly asking, but I sincerely do not know whether to expect an honest answer. Hopefully I will get an honest answer. Now, I'm doing this video in order to make the point more obvious and less complicated, but in this previous video, it was necessary to explain the entire foundation of the problem, defining the equatorial plane, defining the ecliptic plane, explicitly to avoid this sort of argument in semantics about the ecliptic plane and the equatorial plane, to be honest. Of course, you, Igor, are, for some reason, arguing with my frickin' diagrams representation of the H model, as opposed to thinking about the obvious problem with the model in terms of the moon remaining overhead of the tropics throughout the year, practically speaking. Simply put, if the moon's orbital plane is 5 degrees offset from the ecliptic plane, then it couldn't possibly be a tropical phenomenon in the heliocentric model due to the divergence between the equatorial plane, and by extension even the tropics, and the ecliptic plane. Now, I'm doing this video so that hopefully I can explain the problem a little bit better, as I just realized this thing, the same day that I put it out, and I literally pulled an all-nighter to get it completed as quickly as possible and get it out there. And admittedly, I made a couple of minor technical errors in a diagram or two, which have nothing to do with the actual argument, and I've already made corrections for those minor errors that had, no effect on the validity of the argument whatsoever. It's hard to foresee every possible argument in semantics, or straight up lies coming from purported flat earthers. And I might add that everybody makes mistakes. However, the minor mistakes that were made in the diagrams in the previous video were really irrelevant to the point. They were technical errors, and essentially I'm just going to leave the video up. I won't make those corrections. I'll just consider it done in this video because they were insignificant. Self-proclaimed flat earthers. But it's hard to foresee every possible argument in semantics that we're going to encounter when releasing new evidence like this, but it is necessary to improve our arguments. So again, I welcome constructive criticism, but I really don't appreciate people calling me a liar, a fool, and completely misrepresenting my argument, and in the process making complete fools of themselves by totally failing to see the entire crux of the argument. Now, the diagram has nothing to do with the actual problem, of course. So, for example, even if my angles were off, not just mislabeled, that still doesn't solve this problem. But again, the angles were correct, and just it was a mislabeled angle. It was a minor mistake in one case. So, arguing against the diagram instead of the premise is trite and rather shilly. Now, isn't it, Igor? No offense. This is a huge fuck up in the heliocentric theory, and so I had to get it out there, and it was a bit of a rush job, which I pulled an all-nighter to finish, as I've said. I did spend several hours putting this all together, and in hindsight, there were a couple of changes I would make to a diagram or two, but the argument still stands, regardless of your comprehension of it or lack thereof. Igor, if you don't understand something, or if you're just arguing for the sake of argument for some reason, I would strongly suggest that if you're playing devil's advocate like this, that you at least have an understanding of the argument and a logical counter-argument against the main premise, as opposed to arguing semantics. If you're going to play devil's advocate, it would be best if you did so with an effective argument against the premise, as opposed to picking apart diagrams and inserting words into my mouth like parallel. Furthermore, Igor, and we're almost done with this, when you called into Globebusters this past Sunday, you alluded to the notion that you've been attacked and trolled by, quote, followers of the Globebusters, right? Well, I am sorry that you're apparently being trolled. Truly, I am. I know how it feels. I know how annoying that can be. You better trust that. Does this mean you have some type of vendetta against Jaren, Bob, or myself, though? I have personally never done or said anything negative to you up to this point, as far as I can remember. I have seen a few of your videos, and frankly, I thought that you made some good points in the few that I've seen. If people have been mean to you online, I'm sorry, but I'm not responsible for other people's actions. Did you know, by the way, that when you called into Globebusters, though, you basically dissed the entire live audience of Globebusters on just this past Sunday, about 1,000 people, by essentially snubbing your nose at Jaren when he asked you to tell other people where they could find your stuff. You replied, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty much verbatim paraphrasing, "I don't think your audience or platform is the best place to be plugging my channel right now." Do you remember that? At that very moment you were saying those words, there were literally people in the chat saying, "Heart, heart, Orphan Red, ooh, that's so cool, Orphan Red's on the Globebusters." Now, there's a 30-second delay from the time that you're speaking and I can hear you until the time that the audience hears what you said, but I would reckon that you owe about 1,000 people an apology for juxtaposing some imaginary beef that you apparently have with us, or people who watch our show juxtaposing that beef onto us because some people are mean to you and contrary by default in your comment section. Again, really, I am sorry if people are mean to you, but grow a fucking pair, Igor, please. Did you honestly think that you could come out proclaiming the earth is flat and not expect to get attacked by Globe-Tards? Now, personally, I stopped watching your videos, Igor, because it seemed like you were pretty much drunk most of the time, and I didn't personally say or do anything against you, and I didn't even unsubscribe from you. And at that point, I'm unsubscribed now, obviously, but at that point I didn't. And nor did I encourage anyone to do as such. Now, I can't speak for Bob and Jaren, but I would imagine the same thing is true in their case as well, in terms of them never doing anything, you know, to harm you. So I'm not sure, why you would have such angst against us when apparently you're being trolled, which has nothing to do with us. But I guess I'll never understand Canadian women. Maybe that's it. But in any case, the Globebusters, we usually don't attack other flat earthers for no reason, so I don't think it likely that either of them have done anything physically or emotionally to harm you, Igor. So that's the end of that. I'll wrap this up. Just sort of before I get out of here, I want to let you all know thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. I appreciate all you guys. If you want to become a patron, the link's right here. If you want to support through PayPal, the link's right there. I'll put it in the description. It is not obligational, but it is helpful. If you would like to support this channel, that's entirely up to you. So God bless you all. Spread the word, spread the world, and peace. Oh, and before I go, Igor, if you apologize for your behavior and concede that the argument described in the bombshell video is indeed a valid argument, then we're cool. Then it was just a misunderstanding. But until then, I've unsubscribed from your channel, and my feelings from you have gone from anything but certainly not positive, certainly not neutral. I would say that my estimation of your intent is malicious, unless this is a huge misunderstanding. And the only way that I'll know for sure what's the case, one way or another, is if you, just simply apologize and concede that the point described in the video was valid, because it was, and you didn't get it. But anyway, peace out, guys.